If you would, open up to Genesis chapter 9. Genesis chapter 9. As we went through last week, looking at this covenant in Genesis 9, it's rather unique in terms of it is not dependent upon man. A covenant that God made with every generation. He made it with the earth, all the animals, creeping things that came off the ark. And he says, I'm going to set my bow or rainbow in the cloud so that you will know that I will never forget this promise. And to see his faithfulness through those things for millenniums now. Every day, something to be considered of going, you did not worry at all today whenever it started raining, did you? About this is going to be the end. And yet, to know that reassurance is there because of these promises by faith. In seeing these things together and understand these covenants of promise, how abiding they are in terms, even Revelation talks about it in chapter 4, about there's a bow, a rainbow that's around the throne of God, still remembered. Now, notice here in Genesis chapter 9, look down at verse 18. He says, now the sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem and Ham and Japheth, and Ham was the father of Canaan. Notice how it goes out of its way to make sure you know about one descendant in particular. Because if you remember the book of Genesis being written in the wilderness, as God's people are there is one place that is promised to them. As the descendants of Abraham and as what's coming up in Genesis, is promised, is taken to the promised land, the land of Canaan, to the land of Palestine. So here he brings up in particular, Ham was the father of Canaan. Then verse 19, these three were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was populated. And to realize you have descended from one of those three. Now you may not know which one you're descended from. I know I don't. But you notice the point goes way out specifically of saying, no matter who you are reading the book of Genesis, you need to understand that you descended from Shem, Ham, or Japheth. And we've all descended from Noah, of course. Then, look at verse 20 as it comes around to the next aspect of this. He says, then Noah began farming and planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine and became drunk and uncovered himself inside his tent. All of a sudden, all these things that have been left behind in the old world, if you think you got a fresh start, you come to the new world, the old world has been destroyed by flood, to go, what would I want to make sure didn't make it to the new world? Now, we may think kind of maybe in a funny fashion of going, if we were on the ark, would somebody say, well, let's kill the skunks, or let's get rid of some of these mosquitoes and things. But to go in a serious note, what would you really want to get rid of? As you were there on that ark for 365 days of saying, what do I want to be reassured of that I'm not going to bring with me? Now think of the things that they left behind in the old world that they were glad to leave behind. What does it bring up from what we looked at in the past? What are they leaving behind that they're assured to be enjoying of? Evil ways. Think about violence that really consumed the old world. You think in terms of the corruption of even the thoughts of mankind. And going, you come to this point, and Noah begins farming. He plants a vineyard, which is kind of unique, which maybe makes you wonder, did they bring seeds with them on the ark as well? Don't know. But here they are. He says, and he drank of the wine, which tells you some age has come in. He says, and became drunk and uncovered himself inside his tent. Now, you may look at that and think, well, that sounds kind of something. I mean, people get uncovered inside of their own bathrooms. That doesn't seem too crazy. But here we are, here he is in his tent, and that's not really the problem in terms of being uncovered. But here's drunkenness that's been introduced into the new world. And to think, do we ever think that way in terms of going, when you see somebody who's drunk now, of going, man, who brought this stuff into the new world? You realize Noah was a part of that. Now, another aspect here. He says, verse 22, Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. Not only does Ham see his father this way, he makes sure and tell his other brothers. And in doing that, this is the outcome. Verse 23. But Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it upon both their shoulders and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father. And their faces were turned away so that they did not see their father's nakedness. What do you see different inside of Shem and Japheth that's not inside of Ham? Respect, honor. Think in terms of, here they've been told by Ham what the situation is. They take this, it says a garment, they lay it on their shoulders, and they actually walk backwards. And how hard must it have been? And yet that's their desire and the effort to which they're willing to go to not see the nakedness of their own father. Then, verse 24, says, when Noah awoke from his wine, he knew what his youngest son had done to him, which tells you about the birth order. Ham is the youngest of the three. And so he says, whenever he woke up, he knew what had happened. Now, I want you to take a moment and see some parallels between this and where we are in Christ. You think about the comparison that's made in 1 Peter chapter 3, where Peter writes and says, corresponding to that, talking about Noah and the ark, he says, corresponding to that, baptism now saves you, not the removal of dirt from the flesh, but an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And you realize there's an old world and there's a new world. He says, here's baptism that's part of this parallel. So when you start thinking back to the old world, we're talking about old self. When you talk about the new world, what are we talking about in parallel? Here's the new self. And if you remember in Romans 6:6, it specifically talking about through baptism, it says, knowing that our old self was crucified with him. Now, how often do we have to make these kind of choices too? Of going, what am I going to leave behind in the old self and put off, and what am I going to put on in the new self? Now, Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth and their 4 wives were making decisions about what was going to be brought in terms of character into the new world. They would be in charge of teaching the next generation, even after themselves. But I want you to take this opportunity to look over at Colossians chapter 3. Colossians chapter 3, and look down at verse 5. It says, therefore, consider the members of your earthly body as dead to immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and greed, which amounts to idolatry. He says, do you consider yourself dead to those things? Or do you still let those things stay alive inside of us? And if you notice what's listed here, impurity, bringing in any defilement, you can see where drunkenness would fit into that. Passion, I'm going to do what I want to do. You see that aspect here? Evil desire, this is what I want. He says greed amounts to idolatry, verse 6. He says, for it is because of these things that the wrath of God will come upon the sons of disobedience. Had not Noah and Shem, Ham, and Japheth and their wives seen the wrath of God upon sons of disobedience? And what it did to all those people of the old world? And to go, that's the price of wickedness. But now here's Paul making this context and this parallel of saying, look, do you realize the price it's going to cost you if you continue in those things? He says, the wrath of God is going to come upon the sons of disobedience. Verse 7, and in them you also once walked when you were living in them. Now, there was a time where that would be the description of us before we came into Jesus. We were doing wicked things, evil desires, impurity, passions, greed. Verse 8, He says, but now you also put them all aside, anger, wrath, malice, slander, and abusive speech from your mouth. He says, all these things have to be laid aside. And it talks about them really like a garment. He says, here's the things to put off. Here's the things to put on in terms of character and actions. Then, notice the very next statement in verse 9. Do not lie to one another, since you laid aside the old self with its evil practices, and have put on the new self, who is being renewed to a true knowledge according to the image of the one who created him. He says, don't lie to one another. You can't pat each other on the back and say, boy, that's great, when it's not. Because what are you really encouraging somebody to do? Keep sinning. Keep on moving in the wrong direction. You go, we're not helping. That's not real love, is it? So he makes this statement, do not lie to one another. He says, since you laid aside the old self with its evil practices, he says, lying is part of the old self. You can't continue in that. Don't bring that into this new self relationship with Jesus. In the same way that those that were on the ark had to really think about, what am I going to bring to the new world? And what do I want to make sure never comes to the new world when it comes to me? And so specifically here, the aspect in verse 10, he says, and have put on the new self. Notice, it has been, you put it on in Christ, but are you going to continue to put it on? There's a continual sanctification, refinement. He says here, he says, who is being renewed to a true knowledge according to the image of the one who created him. And I've always enjoyed the parallel here. When he says renewed, you probably have a little footnote there. And what does it say? Anybody got a footnote for renewed? Renovated. That's something we kind of grasp in terms of renovating a house. It's still got the sticks of wood for the 2x4s, but you're peeling everything about what's really structurally sound within it. If it's not structurally sound, you pull it out. And you're going to finish it off in a way that is far more pleasing than the way it was before. When you think about it that way, of thinking about being renewed according to the new self, of going, I can't bring the old self with me. I can't drag it along and be content to stay in the same place. I got to put on the new self. And notice who's it up to. This is dependent upon us. Now, the old self was crucified with Christ, but what are we going to do now? Here he brings it together. He says, the new self who is being renovated. What does that tell you about the process? It's ongoing. And to go, here's the refinement year after year after year, hopefully if we're responding out of faith. And then he says, renewed to a true knowledge according to the image of the one who created him. Sometimes when you renew a house, you might go, I'm not sure what I want this to turn into in the end. What is God trying to renew us to be like? Like Jesus. To me, this is one of the greatest advantages in parenting, is to go, I already know who I want my children to be like. The question is, how can I parent to help this process? Because I want them to be like the image of the one that made in God's image. I want them to be like Jesus. And I know you do too, for your children and your grandchildren. And so you look at this and go, all right, I want to do that even before we come to this relationship with Jesus. But to go, I know the time is coming. He says, spiritual death is going to come in. And to go, how am I going to respond? But here specifically about putting on the new self, he says, according to the image of the one who created him. And you go, who else can create but God? Then verse 11, he says, a renewal in which there is no distinction between Greek and Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave and free man, but Christ is all and in all. Does it matter your nationality or background? He's trying to renovate us all to be just like who? Just like Jesus. And to go, and we have to be the ones to say, I can't bring the old world into the new life. Then if you notice, he starts talking about things to put on, verse 12. He says, so as those who have been chosen of God, holy and beloved, put on a heart of compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, bearing with one another and forgiving each other. Whoever has a complaint against anyone, just as the Lord forgave you, so also should you. Notice he says, put on a heart. He says, this is not the idea of God saying just a transplant. He says, I've already created within you a new heart. What are you going to do with this thing? He says, are you going to put on compassion? You're going to put on kindness? And you might look at some of these statements and go, man, that's not easy. And that's not natural. That's part about putting on new clothes. You go, it takes effort. If you've ever had a broken arm or a broken leg or something, you go, man, it's not easy to get clothes on. When everything's not functioning really good to start with, he says, here, put on a heart of compassion and kindness and humility and gentleness and patience. And then especially, he says, bearing with one another. Sometimes that's part of it. You just bear with one another. And you're trying to help. And then he says, forgiving each other. He says, whoever has a complaint against anyone. He says, got any complaints? He says, what do you do with them? He says, well, as the Lord forgave you, so also should you. He says, oh yeah, I remember what God did with my complaints. He forgave me. That's the way I should be too. As you think through these things, you can bring old self stuff into the new life. But what will it do to you? It'll corrupt you and it'll kill you. And then what can we expect from God? Here's the wrath of God that returns. And you go, and it returned because I made the choice, as opposed to putting on the new self. Now, come back to Genesis chapter 9. So Noah decides, nothing wrong with farming, nothing wrong with planting a vineyard. He says, then to become drunk, and then to be exposed even in terms of the eyes of Ham. Ham's choices, notice Ham's choices come with a great penalty of dishonoring a parent. Verse 25. So he said, talking about Noah, cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants he shall be to his brothers. Who gets cursed first? Canaan. You would expect it to say who? Ham. He says, cursed be Canaan, which tells you there's probably been some time elapsed since the flood, since they don't begin having the next generation of children for about 100 years, and we'll look more at that in chapter 11. But he says, cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants, he shall be to his brothers. He says, he also said, blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servants. He says, let Canaan be servants of Shem. And by the way, you're going to find out in chapter 10 that Shem is the oldest of the three sons. So, he continues on, verse 27. May God enlarge Japheth and let him dwell in the tents of Shem and let Canaan be his servant. He says, let Japheth and Shem dwell together, but let Ham be their servants. I can't answer that question. It is interesting, isn't it? And we'll see it. If you look down in chapter 10, and you can look down at verse 21, it says, also to Shem, the father of all the children of Eber, and the older brother of Japheth, children were born. And you go, there's your birth order between the three sons. And so why are they listed in that way? I don't know. But that's what it is. Shem's the oldest, Japheth the middle son, and Ham's the youngest. And between these cursings and blessings, you go, here's what's laid out in order. The descendants of Canaan are going to be servants of Japheth and Shem. Verse 28. Noah lived 350 years after the flood, so all the days of Noah were 950 years. Think about all the things that Noah saw. I mean, typically when someone gets to be in their 90s or turns 100 nowadays, we think they have seen a drastic change in life. I mean, you think about right now, if somebody was born 100 years ago, I mean, to live, before telephones being very popular at all, to live before, so many things that we think of in terms of technology. So many people, even in terms of 100 years ago, don't even have running water in the house. don't even have facilities in the house. And yet we think, man, that's a long time to go through world wars, to go through all these different events of the past. Yet for Noah, 950 years, think about how broad of a spectrum that covers. To go from a world that's full of violence, every thought was only evil continually, to come to a new world of 8 souls and go, it's only going to be what we bring into it, at least at first. And to go, what a drastic difference in that 1 year in the ark between. To go, what a spectrum. What did he learn about God? Through his life, what did Noah learn about God? His faithfulness. He knew that if I respond out of faith, God will keep his covenant promises. Now, what can we also learn about putting off the old self and putting on the new self? Is it not the same thing? God's faithful to his covenant promises. And to go and look at, he'll always respond as long as I'm walking out of faith. And we may make mistakes like Noah did, and to understand, here's Noah responding. He's saying, look, bless the God of Shem. He says, let Canaan be his servants. Then to go, chapter 10 opens up, and chapter 10's kind of a unique chapter. I kind of debated on how much time to really go through some of these things. Genesis chapter 10 is almost like you're filling in a map. It is, I've heard some people say, it's like the table of nations, because there's so many different nations that are mentioned through all the descendants that come in Genesis chapter 10. The verses 2 through 5 are the descendants of Japheth. Verses 6 through 20 are the descendants of Ham. Verses 21 through 31 are the descendants of Shem. And of course, Shem's bloodline is what's going to lead to Jesus in the end. So, notice a couple of these things. Genesis chapter 10, look at verse 1. It says, now these are the records of the generations of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the sons of Noah. And sons were born to them after the flood. Notice, no children are born on the ark. Verse 2. The sons of Japheth were Gomer and Magog, and Madai, and Javan, and Tubal, and Meshach, and Tyrus. The sons of Gomer were Ashkenaz, and Riphath, and Togarmah. Sorry, I'm going to stumble through some of these. The sons of Javan were Elishah, and Tarshish, Kittim, and Dodanim. You think of these different names, and I know they're going to be hard to remember, but I'm going to give you a little idea, and maybe make a little footnote if you're a note taker. Ezekiel chapter 27, verses 12 through 14. Ezekiel chapter 27 is about a lament for the king of Tyre. If you think about where Palestine is, Tyre and Sidon are in the north along the Mediterranean Sea. This lament is being made over him because all of his mercantile is going down. What he has done, if you read through all of Ezekiel 27, you find out they have made a fortune based upon shipping by ships and taking cargo to other shores, other places, port cities, selling their goods and coming back and doing this over and over again. And their trade really touched all the way over to the coastlines along Spain, current-day Spain, even down through toward the south, what we would call northern Africa. Out of all those things, I just want to read these 3 verses to you. He says, Tarshish was your customer because of the abundance of all kinds of wealth. With silver, iron, tin, and lead they paid for your wares. Javan, Tubal, and Meshach, they were your traders. With the lives of men and vessels of bronze, they paid for your merchandise. Those from Beth Togarmah, house of Togarmah, gave horses and war horses and mules for your wares. You notice all these places are mentioned. Now, back here in Genesis chapter 10, they're just men. But later on, they're going to grow into cities and nations. And then look at the very next verse here in Genesis chapter 10, verse 5. He says, from these, all these descendants of Japheth, the coastlands of the nations were separated into their lands, everyone according to his language, according to their families, into their nations. Where did all these descendants seem to set up residence? Along the coastlands. And their descendants are going to, here, once again, we're talking about men here in Genesis 10. But over time, where these men are going to dwell are going to turn into cities named after themselves, also nations after themselves. And so you see that played out exactly that way in Ezekiel chapter 27. Now we move on to the sons of Ham. Now you already know the destiny of Ham because Noah's already given the curse on the descendants of Canaan. Verse 6 says, the sons of Ham were Cush, Mizraim, and Put, and Canaan. So Ham has at least 4 sons, specifically 4 mentioned, and going, all right, all of these, out of these 4, 3 of them he's going to tell you about the next generation beyond them. Verse 7. The sons of Cush were Seba and Havilah, and Sabta and Ramah and Sabteka, and the sons of Ramah were Sheba and Dedan. You go, man, listen to all those things. Now, you might be thinking back to Genesis chapter 2. There was a Havilah mentioned back there, but I'm going to show you, it's probably not this one. It's probably one that's coming later in the chapter, and you'll see why. Verse 8. Now, Cush became the father of Nimrod. He became a mighty one on the earth. And you go, okay, now we're moving down through some generations. We got Noah, Ham, Cush. Cush has a son by the name of Nimrod. And like I've said before, if you call somebody a Nimrod now, that's not the highest compliment. But back here in Genesis 10, apparently it was, because in verse 9 it says, therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. And you go, okay, if you remember, now that we're after the flood, what can they eat? They can eat meat. So if you're a hunter, man, that's great. Man, you can kill. You can bring it together. We have to make sure to take the blood out first. But here it is. And so Nimrod became known. And if you were a good hunter, they'd just, well, you're a Nimrod, aren't you? And they would take that as a compliment, as opposed to being like, hey, let's take this outside. But don't do that. Then verse 10. Notice the line of what Nimrod's going to bring with him. Verse 10. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel. Now, I know that's ringing a bell for your head for chapter 11. He says, and Erech and Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar. Now, of course, in verse 10, you talk about Babel. Later on, this is going to be the kingdom of Babylon. And the Tower of Babel, of course, is coming in chapter 11. Now, here's another aspect of what's here. If you notice in verse 10, it says, in the land of Shinar. Any stories that come to mind about Shinar? Nope, he's not from Shinar. We'll talk about where he's from here in a minute. All right, in Daniel, yeah, the very beginning of Daniel talks about whenever those who are faithful, I won't all say about all of them being faithful, but when those who are taken from Jerusalem after it's been destroyed, get taken captive back to Babylon, and they're taken to the land of Shinar. Now, if you were to look at the first 2 verses of chapter 11 in Genesis, the Tower of Babel is also going to be in the land of Shinar, which tells you we're dealing with the same things. So, notice how it continues. There's a couple other things with Shinar. The king of Shinar is going to be over in Genesis chapter 14. You may think about Achan, whenever he took things that were under the ban from Jericho, he took a garment or mantle from Shinar. So you see some of these same things being continual. Verse 11, he says, from that land he went forth into Assyria and built Nineveh and Rehoboth-ir and Calah. Now, you go, Assyria? Well, isn't that exactly where Nineveh is? Isn't it among the Assyrians? Yeah, it certainly is. Now, what Old Testament books are written to those of Nineveh? Jonah and Nahum are both written. So you realize now, we're ways on down the line, and keep in mind, Genesis chapter 10, they're just men. But notice it's starting to go ahead and tell you, they're going to turn into the Assyrians. There's going to be part of there in Babylon or Babel. The land of Shinar, he's going to giving you all these pieces to be able to put together. Then verse 12, he says, and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah, this is the great city. Isn't that exactly the way that it's talked about in the book of Jonah? Nineveh being the great city, which tells you, man, we're learning things that are really farther down the line. but you're seeing the roots of them here, right after the flood, just 2 or 3, 4 generations after the flood. Then, continues on, verse 13. It says, Mizraim became the father of Ludum and Anamim and Lahabim and Naphtuhim and Patrushan and, all right, now catch a load of this one, Casluhim. Do you know any Casluhims? You do. You might not realize it, though. Because notice the next little phrase. Who comes from them? The Philistines. You know Goliath. So you start to see, these are giving you all the roots of everything else. It's almost like just filling out the map with where these places are and times and peoples. Then he continues on, verse 15. Canaan became the father of Sidon, his firstborn. Now, Sidon, remember Tyre and Sidon later on become actual nations, and going, here are the descendants. Now, you look through some of these things and be real careful here, because on the surface you go, okay, we see how this thing can fit. Could this be some other people and what we're looking at down the road? Yes, it could. So just see what's kind of here for face value. Then, notice what else is here. Verse 15, it goes on. It says, Canaan became the father of Sidon, his firstborn in Heth, and the Jebusite and the Amorite and the Girgashite and the Hivite and the Arkite and the Sinite and the Arvadite and the Zamorite and the Hamathite, and afterwards the families of the Canaanite were spread abroad. And you look at all those nations and all those peoples, but real quickly, look over at Genesis chapter 18. Excuse me, Genesis chapter 15. This is chapter 15. Look at verse 18. You're going to see 4 of those get mentioned by name. So, here it comes. Here's the Lord speaking. Genesis 15:18. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram. Now, we're not going to read about everything that comes before. We'll see that down the road. He says, made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I have given the land from the river of Egypt, the Nile River, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates. He says, the Kenite and the Kenizzite and the Cadmonite and the Hittite and the Perizzite and the Rephaim, pay attention to these last 4 in verse 21, and the Amorite and the Canaanite and the Girgashite and the Jebusite. Those last 4, the Canaanite is assumed of being descendants of Canaan. Jebusites, you know what city they're from? Jerusalem. It was formerly called Jebus before it was called Jerusalem. And realize these are 4 of the nationalities of people who are going to be destroyed whenever God's people take the promised land. And to notice, if you come back to Genesis chapter 10, when you read verse 16, specifically, and the Jebusite and the Amorite and the Girgashite. And you can understand the Canaanites is part of this group too in terms of being destroyed. Not mentioned here though. Then, except for in verse 18 where you see the families of the Canaanites, which is really this whole group. So, then, verse 19. The territory of the Canaanite extended from Sidon as you go toward Gerar as far as Gaza. Isn't that what people call that strip there along the Mediterranean Sea? He says, Gaza Strip. As you go towards Sodom and Gomorrah and Admah and Zeboim as far as Lasha. Now, you don't necessarily read about it in Genesis, but the last 2 cities, Admah and Zeboim, are destroyed in the exact same fashion as Sodom and Gomorrah are. And you can read about that in Deuteronomy chapter 29, verse 23. So understand, here are people who are going to be destroyed in further times. And it was because of their wickedness. So you know, man, it's there and present. Verse 20. These are the sons of Ham according to their families, according to their languages, by their lands, by their nations. Have you noticed these statements, like back in verse 5 with the descendants of Jephthah, according to his language? You notice down here in verse 20, these are the sons of Ham according to their families, according to their languages. You notice how it's talking about languages being different? Because you know the story that's coming in chapter 11, don't you? About the Tower of Babel. These descendants cover from after the flood to the Tower of Babel events and beyond. This is a wide spectrum of time that's being covered through these, up to this point, it's just 4 generations deep. But now that we're going to get to the descendants of Shem, we're going to get to like 9 or 10 generations from Noah all the way to Abram. So look at verse 21. Also to Shem, the father of all the children of Eber. Now you may be thinking, why point out anything special about Eber? Why is he so special? That's not a name I really recognize very much. And some of you may recognize it very well. He says, and the older brother of Japheth, children were born. And the older brother of Japheth is a description of Shem. So, you get a picture here. All the children of Eber are descendants of Shem, verse 22 and 23. It says, the sons of Shem were Elam and Asher and Arpachshad and Lud and Aram. The sons of Aram were Uz and Hul and Gether and Mash. Now, Uz, later on in Scripture, there's going to be a brothers by the name of Buz and Uz. It sounds like a comic strip to me, but it's reality. But here at this point, it says the sons of Aram were Uz. And if you read the very, very beginning of the book of Job, Job chapter 1, verse 1, I'll read it to you real quick. It says, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was blameless, upright, fearing God, and turning away from evil. And you go, somehow Job fit into this land. It doesn't give you an idea about time-wise. And once again, in Genesis chapter 10, these names are just men. But later on, you see the plethora of nations that are born out of these men later on. So, now you get back on track, verse 24. Arpachshad. If anybody's going to have a son or a grandson, what a great name, just waiting there for you. But Arpachshad became a father of Shelah, and Shelah became the father of Eber. Oh, now we get to Eber. It was bringing up Eber before. Why is he so important? Verse 25 will tell you why. 2 sons were born to Eber. The name of the one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided. Peleg means divided. It says, and in the days of Peleg, and the days of Peleg are roughly 200 to 400 years after the flood. He says, in his lifetime, the earth was divided. Now, what do you think this is referring to?
What's the thing about Pangea?
Nope, it has nothing to do with Pangea. Nope, not the righteous and the unrighteous. Yes, languages. Chapter 11, that's exactly where it's going to lead into. It's about the division of languages. That's why it's important about Peleg being divided. So you get the picture here. He says, and his brother's name was Joktan. All these wonderful names back here, And he's going to describe here about Joktan, his descendants. He says, Joktan became the father of Almadad and Sheleph, and oh boy, Hazar Maveth and Jerah, and Hadoram and Uzal. I tell you, Joktan, he really thought about that promise of be fruitful and multiply. He says, Uzal and Diklah and Obal and Abimael and Sheba and Ophir and Havilah and Jobab. All these were the sons of Joktan. Now, you go through and count all those and you realize, man, there's a lot of descendants here. Now, here's a little thing I kind of made a little note about earlier. In verse 29, it says, and Ophir and Havilah. Havilah is mentioned back in Genesis chapter 2, and it's describing about where those 4 rivers are, the Pishon and the Gishon and the Tigris and the Euphrates. And it talks about specifically about Havilah. And right after there, it talks about, and there was a land that had a lot of gold. Have you ever heard of the gold of Ophir? Because it's all over the Old Testament. I mean, all over it. It's even talked about in Job twice, the book of Job. In Job chapter 22 and Job chapter 28. And so you see these things together and go, Ophir and Havilah, yeah, this is probably what was really being talked about in terms of a place. Now, once again, just men's names here in Genesis 10. But you see where things are going. Then, verse 30. Now their settlement extended from Mesha as you go towards Saphir, the hill country of the east. These are the sons of Shem according to their families, according to their languages. You see how it's making sure it includes that in all the descendants that come out of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Each time when you get to the end, now it doesn't say it at the beginning, because the days of Peleg come, and then what happens to languages? They get divided. And you see, here's what he's bringing out. He says, these are sons of Shem according to their families, according to their languages, by their lands, according to their nations. Now, I hope you realize by now, there is truly only one race of mankind. But there are a lot of different nationalities. And so he brings these things up over and over again, about their lands, according to their nations. And you can just imagine, for us, I know a lot of this geography of where these places are is maybe something that we're not very familiar with. And do yourself a favor if you really want to kind of get an extra bit here. Google and just put in map of Genesis chapter 10. Now, I tried to find one that was really good, and I just never found one that was suitable. But go through and you'll notice how it lays out these nations in different places. And understand some of those things are guesses. But at the same time, if you were an Israelite in the wilderness and Moses has written these things down and then you get to Genesis chapter 10, I mean, can you imagine if they started describing different cities that you were aware of or other states that you've been to and going, oh, that's how that fits. That's where that, no wonder these people in Canaan were destroyed or going to be destroyed. You go, oh, wow, I know about these people. It would really make for them the book of Genesis just jump off the page. And yet for us, because we're just not familiar with the geography and the layout and the history of the Old Testament sometimes, we go, well, what's going on here? And why go through all these names? And why all these funny names together? But realize for them, this was like, wow, this is like the ancestry of everybody back to the flood. Amazing. Then, verse 32. He says, these are the families of the sons of Noah, according to their genealogies, by their nations, and out of these the nations were separated on the earth after the flood. He says, and this is how we started to take over the lands that are around. And you realize, what a beautiful picture. Next week, Genesis chapter 11, we'll get to make a little more sense of this, and look out, there's another genealogy coming our way.